Richard Nixon was president. Punk rock was king. All in the Family and Sesame Street were on television, and disco was everywhere. This is the 1970s. During the 1970s, the economic system was in shambles. It looked like the baby boom generation might be the first generation to do worse than their parents economically. You've heard of inflation? Well, the 1970s was a time of stagflation. The buying power of the dollar was at an all-time low, and unemployment was climbing rapidly. There were a lot of reasons for this stagflation. The Vietnam War was robbing us of our best and our brightest. It was draining tax dollars. Women and teenagers were entering the workforce on a larger scale than ever before, creating more untrained workers. And Germany and Japan were actually passing the United States as the leading producers of technology. It was a grim time to be alive. In the mounting protests of the late 60s and early 70s, Nixon comes up with a new plan. This plan was called Vietnamisation. This was Nixon's plan to withdraw 540,000 American troops from Vietnam and turn over the fighting to the Vietnamese soldiers themselves. In fact, he came up with a policy called the Nixon Doctrine. Richard Nixon said the United States could no longer afford to be the stalwart bulwark of democracy that we had always been, and that we would honor our current commitments to the countries that had been fighting communism. But as for the rest of you, we just can't afford to do it anymore. You'll have to finance your own wars. The North Vietnamese were seeking refuge in Cambodia, a neighboring country that was officially neutral. But in April of 1970, Richard Nixon went on television and told us that Cambodia was acting as a hostile nation, and the U.S. began carpet bombing Cambodia, a nation we weren't at war with. The congressional response: Congress withdrew the Gulf of Tonkin resolutions. The old blank check they'd given LBJ, it wasn't there anymore. In fact, in November of 1973, they passed the War Powers Act. The president was given 48 hours to notify Congress of any use of military force that he was doing. We also passed the 26th Amendment in the 1970s. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. I mean, if you're old enough to die for your country, shouldn't you be able to vote for the people that sent you there to die? The diplomatic watchword of the 1970s was détente. Détente's a French word and it means relaxation. The idea was that we would relax hostilities between the Soviet Union and the United States. China and the Soviet Union were quarreling with each other over who the true heir to Marxism was, and the world seemed very unstable. So we entered into a series of agreements with the Soviet Union. We made the Great Grain Deal in 1972, where we made a 3-year agreement with the Soviet Union that the United States would supply at least $750 million worth of wheat, corn, and other cereals to help the starving Soviet people. We also entered into the ABM Treaty, or the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. The ABM Treaty was publicly a huge success. It limited the Soviet Union and the United States only to defensive missiles. Both superpowers agreed that they would produce no more offensive missiles. Think about that for a minute. What is the difference between a defensive missile and an offensive missile? In reality, it's just how you use it, right? Well, the world looked at it and we cheered. The world was safer because we no longer had offensive missiles. In reality, both the Soviet Union and the United States just redefined their missiles as defensive. We also entered into the first SALT Treaty, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty. SALT's still around today. SALT forbade elaborate weapon systems in space. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed to never militarize space. This is something that we still agree to today, even though the Soviet Union has collapsed. Publicly, all of these things were a success. In reality, both nations ignored it in redefined terms. Nixon had some issues with his court. When he first came into power, Chief Justice Earl Warren was in power. Earl Warren was the architect of such decisions as Gideon versus Wainwright that said that all persons have a right to counsel. The Miranda case, the Miranda decision that says you have a right to remain silent. And even Engel v. Vitale and Abington School District versus Shemp that said that you couldn't have organized prayer at schools. But he's replaced by Chief Justice Warren Burger, a conservative. Or at least Nixon thought he was a conservative. By the time the Roe versus Wade case comes before the court, 4 of the 9 justices were Nixon appointees. Nixon should have easily been able to get his way with the court by this point. But in 1973, in Roe v. Wade, probably the most controversial Supreme Court decision of all time, abortion on demand was legalized everywhere. It wasn't a state right anymore. It was a federal right. And it's still one today. History books always refer to Nixon as a cold warrior, as a man that was most known for his willingness to fight communism. And that's what he had been when he was in Congress. It's what he was when he was vice president. But as president, he's oftentimes a domestic warrior. Nixon increased welfare spending more than any president since Franklin Roosevelt. He established the SSI tax, which gave money to the disabled and the indigent. He raised Social Security pensions. He created the Environmental Protection Agency after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had scared everybody about the dangers of DDT. Even passed the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act. For a man that's remembered to be pretty conservative, these are some progressive things that Nixon did. "1972, Richard Nixon runs for re-election. He's challenged by Democrat George McGovern. George McGovern is a peace supporter. He wants to end the war at all costs. But Richard Nixon sent Henry Kissinger over to Vietnam to negotiate with Lee Duc Tho, and Henry Kissinger returned shortly before voting happened and said, "Peace is at hand. We're about to end this war." And suddenly George McGovern's peaceful protests and his Dove platform, the peace platform, it seemed ridiculous. It seemed like Nixon had won this war. Nixon was right. And in 1972, Richard Nixon wins a landslide victory over George McGovern, 520 to 17. President Nixon may have won one of the most lopsided victories in American presidential history, but he's not going to get to enjoy it for long. You see, scandal plagues the Nixon administration. June 17, 1972, Republican operatives broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters office in the Watergate Hotel in Washington, D.C. They were searching for information on McGovern, maybe even an advanced copy of his speech, so Nixon could prepare better to defeat McGovern, something he didn't need to do. We know that Nixon easily defeats George McGovern. But it's alleged, or at least accused, that the president had ordered this break-in. If that's the case, the president's committed a crime. And in the United States, the president is not above the law. Americans demanded an investigation. Congress opened up hearings, the famous Watergate hearings. They subpoenaed the president's papers, but they also subpoenaed the president's tapes. You see, Richard Nixon had put recording machines in all of his offices in the White House. Why have recording machines? Nixon wanted credit for whatever good his administration did, and he knew that if he had tapes of this later on, he could put these in his presidential library, and nobody was stealing the credit from Richard Nixon. Well, now Congress wants them. The president at first refuses to turn them over, claiming executive privilege. This is the belief that there are some things that the people just don't need to know. National security, you know. The Supreme Court rules the president's wrong and orders the tapes turned over. Nixon agrees to turn over a written copy of the tapes, not the tapes themselves, but we will turn over a script of what was there. This was a mistake. It turns out that Richard Nixon had colorful language, and the secretaries that were typing up all of these things, every time they got to a spot where Richard Nixon might have used profanity, instead of putting the word that Nixon used, they would just put expletive deleted there. Why is that worse? Well, because if you're anything like me, you're going to fill that spot with the worst words you could. Now Richard Nixon sounds like he cusses like a drunk sailor on leave. Beyond that, there were also large markouts in these scripts. And when Congress asked what was marked out, Nixon said, "These are matters of national security. They're top secret. You don't have the clearance." Americans smelled a rat. To make matters worse, in October of 1973, Richard Nixon's own vice president resigns. Spiro Agnew takes a deal. He was being investigated for some financial irregularities when he had been governor. And the deal was made that if he resigned the vice presidency, charges would be dropped. Well, that creates a vacancy in the vice presidency. Do you know how you fill a vacancy in the vice presidency? Well, the Constitution says the president appoints somebody and then Congress approves it. Richard Nixon appoints Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford was Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was a congressman from Ohio and a former professional football player. Jerry Ford was not seen as real bright, but easily controlled. So Jerry Ford ends up becoming easily approved by Congress. Shortly thereafter, in 1974, Richard Nixon himself resigns the presidency, and America has an unelected president. Jerry Ford becomes president of the United States, and nobody outside of the state of Ohio had ever voted for him. Gerald Ford comes into the presidency with some goodwill. He seemed like an honest man. But right out of the gate, Jerry Ford makes probably the most critical error of his presidency. He pardons President Nixon for any crime that he may or may not have committed. Here's the problem. Nixon hasn't been convicted of anything. So why would Jerry Ford pardon a man of a crime he hasn't been convicted of? Well, I'll take Gerald Ford at his word. Jerry Ford said that the reason why he did this is because he wanted the nation to be able to put itself beyond the pains of the Watergate conspiracy. America needed to heal itself. And by doing the pardon, it allowed him to get on with his work and America to get on with being Americans and to get past this terrible scandal. The problem is, that's not what it looks like happened. It looks like we had a buddy deal. It looks like President Nixon said, listen, Jerry, I'll make you president if you make sure I don't go to jail. And a lot of Americans lost their faith in Jerry Ford shortly thereafter. On April 19, 1975, President Ford ordered the evacuation of the few American personnel that were left in Vietnam. As they're evacuating from the embassy, you can see North Vietnamese soldiers marching in. They took a tank through the front gate, and Americans are evacuating off a helicopter off the top of the embassy. They're also taking a lot of Vietnamese people that had fought next to the Americans with them. Initially, there's 140,000 Vietnamese that come back with the Americans. Eventually, that number reaches 500,000. It changed America dramatically. The 1970s was also the highlight of feminism. Everywhere women were fighting for more equality. Now, they'd had the right to vote since the age of Wilson, but they still didn't have all the rights. We call this the Title IX generation because Title IX passes in the education law, which said that for every dollar you spend on sports for a male sport, you need to spend that same dollar for a female sport. For every dollar you spend educating a male student, you need to spend that same dollar educating a female student. The Title IX policy was wonderful. It created equality in our public schools. It created equality in our colleges. It was a wonderful, wonderful program. There was also the Equal Rights Amendment that was put out there. The Equal Rights Amendment, which, by the way, had been first proposed in 1923, was still kicking around out there. In the 1970s, it gets a big kick in the rear, and basically what it said was that women were equal to men. You'd think this is something that everybody could get behind, and a lot of women did. Now, the National Organization for Women championed the Equal Rights Amendment, but some women didn't. Women like Phyllis Schlafly was called an anti-feminist. Phyllis Schlafly said that she was insulted by the Equal Rights Amendment by suggesting that they needed a special amendment to give women's rights, was saying that they didn't already have rights. I think Phyllis Schlafly might have had a point. Her argument was The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments already guarantee all citizens the rights to vote and the rights of citizenship. Am I not a citizen? The amendment dies in 1982, 3 states shy of passing. We still don't have an ERA. In 1976, Gerald Ford chooses to run for election in his own right. Remember, Jerry Ford had never been elected by anyone. He was appointed vice president and became president upon Richard Nixon's absenteeism. He's challenged by Governor of Georgia, James Earl Carter. Jimmy Carter was running as a Washington outsider. He had never been in Congress, never been in the Senate. He had been a governor. And he kind of ran on an all-shucks country boy kind of attitude. After all, he was a peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia. Before that, he was an officer on a nuclear-powered ship, but he ran as a peanut farmer from Georgia. Americans liked his honesty, and after the Nixon years and the Ford pardon, Americans wanted a change, and Americans turned to Democrat Jimmy Carter, and he wins 297 to 240. Not a landslide, but a pretty good victory. This is going to usher in the Carter years. The 1970s were dealing with racial issues as well. You remember the Brown versus Board of Education case. It ruled that segregation in public schools was discrimination and therefore illegal. The way a lot of school districts solved that was through busing. They would put kids on buses and ship them to schools in order to forcefully integrate communities. Sometimes these kids would spend an hour on a bus or longer. People were complaining that there's a school just down the road from me and my kid's getting on a bus and being shipped an hour away to go to school. And they sued, and it went to the Supreme Court. And in 1974, in Milliken versus Bradley, the Supreme Court ruled that the busing of students outside of a school district for integration purposes was unconstitutional. It wasn't something that it was in excess of the decision of Brown versus Board of Education. What Brown said was that you could not prevent somebody from attending a community school. It didn't say you had to send somebody to another community. Our cities were also changing dramatically. Something called white flight was happening. In the 1970s, our downtown areas were becoming largely minority areas because the whites, who seemed to be more middle class than lower class, were fleeing for the suburbs, for low-price homes in the suburbs, leaving the downtown areas to rot. Another big issue in this time period was affirmative action. In the rush to solve the discrimination problems between races, some states and universities put in affirmative action policies, which favors a historically disadvantaged group over a historically advantaged group. What this means is that if you have a black student and a white student in 1974 that are equally qualified to go to school, you give the scholarship to the black student because you're making up for the time period when these black students were not allowed to go to these schools. I think the heart was in the right place. But a lot of white Americans screamed foul. They called this reverse racism, when racism by another name is just racism. Carter comes in with a lot of love from Americans. Carter is often remembered as a failed president, but still remembered fondly as a good man today. One of the first things he does as president is he pardons the Vietnam draft dodgers, those people who had fled the country rather than go to Vietnam. This is part of his healing program. He also initiates the Camp David Accords, where he gets the prime ministers of Egypt and Israel to come to Camp David and meet, and negotiates a peace between these two nations that had been fighting since the 1950s. He promised to return the Panama Canal to Panama, something that a lot of Americans were against. We had built the Panama Canal. It was ours. But Jimmy Carter argued that, first off, we had never really justifiably taken the Panama Canal. We had stolen it. And since it's in Panama, it should belong to the Panamanians. But there were also economic reasons. Ships had gotten bigger than they were able to cross at the Panama Canal. And frankly, the expense of maintaining the canal was more than America could handle. The measuring stick upon which we will always measure the Carter administration, though, is the Iran hostage scandal. Iran had a king, Shah Reza Mohammad Pahlavi. Shah Pahlavi had been put on the throne largely with the help of the United States in the 1950s. He'd westernized Iran. He'd been a good ally to us. Americans had gotten rich because of the Shah. But he'd also largely secularized Iran, something that the Islamic majority of the people didn't much care for. And he was a bit of a tyrant sometimes. He did use his military police to enforce his will. Well, Shah Pahlavi was diagnosed with cancer, and he came to the United States in order to get treatment. While in our nation, a revolution happened in Iran. And the Ayatollah Khomeini, an Islamic caliph, comes to power, and they establish an Islamic Republic in Iran. The Islamic Republic puts a death sentence on the Shah as being an enemy of the state and orders the United States to return the Shah. President Carter says we stand by our friends and allow Shah Pahlavi to stay in our country. The result of this? Americans are ordered out of the country. When we didn't leave, our embassy was attacked. The embassy workers were captured, and for over a year they were held hostage. Every night on TV, we got to see pictures of American embassy workers held hostage by a foreign government.